told you. No, because I start by asking people to raise their hands. How many people can actually read this? It's not too bad. I would have expected more in this venue, but...
Sorry, I'm just too late.
Yeah, you're too late. Because I do a version of this presentation for some of the corporate entities that I advise sometimes. So this presentation, so that's... I do the translation. They still don't understand, but that's beside the point. So who am I? I talked about this earlier. Whoops, sorry. So basically, I do security advocacy, so evangelism if you prefer, and I do some threat research. I'm currently working on some personal projects. I'm actually on kind of like a sabbatical. I am looking for a job, but that's a different problem. I've got 30 plus years experience. I need to really update that byline. I keep forgetting to do it. And it's like, didn't I just say this earlier too? So the background of this is that I used to be in incident response. I used to be for large corporations. So I have a traditional incident response background. I'm a GCIH, not gold, but I will be working on my gold paper. So I've had a lot of experience in the traditional incident response, right? So you get an event, you investigate, you respond, and you contain and you correct. A few years ago, along came threat hunting, right? So what we found as an industry, right, is that in fact, incident response responds well, pun, to the aspect of detecting things that you know, right? So as long as you have indicators, your incident response team usually reacts quickly. The problem comes about when you are looking for the unknowns. Well, there's too many things that get past us today and that SOX and incident response doesn't pick up. The other challenge is that we're seeing adversaries that are becoming more and more cunning. They don't use, and they're very creative. They don't use the traditional mechanisms that you might see. What we used to know. We used to go after the script keys and all this stuff, and we used to find things. The compromises are given nowadays, right? I never talk to an organization that doesn't think it's been compromised in one way or another, and they don't know about it. And some of you who are in the industry, some of you probably have run into this, is that the common conception nowadays is that, yes, I'm compromised. I know it. I don't know where. I don't know how. But I'm going to have to deal with it sometime, and when I find out, I'll deal with it. We had incident response. Incident response had a previous, has evolved already today to be more militarized. So this is the Aoda Loop. Does everybody know what the Aoda Loop is? So it's a military, it comes out of the military. So it's basically you observe your situation, you orient yourself to decide where you're going, you decide what you're going to do, and then you act, right? So incident response is slowly evolving into this type of Aoda Loop, and you'll see a lot of vendors that talk about SIMs and things like that. They actually focus now more on this Aoda Loop than the traditional incident response activities of, prepare, detect, investigate, contain, and things like that. This is a lot more dynamic in terms of what you can do in your environment. And essentially threat hunting falls into this observe and orient aspect, right? Because what you're going to do is you're going to look through all the events which you're going to gather, and you're going to find an incident that you've never seen before. What is threat hunting? So, what does a threat hunter do? It's the process of really searching through every log and everything that you've collected to detect something that's never been detected before, right? So, the traditional incident responder will work on a dashboard in a SIM, or work on an event, or work on an alert, work on a ticket. It's something that's been detected already. In threat hunting, you're doing a proactive move of actually looking for things that you've never seen before, and you're actually trying to find new compromises that you haven't heard of before. And this is where it breaks down when you talk to some vendors and some companies that offer threat hunting services, because they are doing it based on indicators. Right? So they have this whole bunch of stuff where they're collecting data from you, and then they have a bunch of indicators and they trigger on indicators. That's traditional incident response. but they're calling it threat hunting. All right. So, I don't remember why I put this in. Probably just a break. Threat hunting really is about balancing your creative mind and your logical mind, right? So you need to have a certain aspect of creativity because you kind of have to put yourself in the mindset of the attacker, of the malicious person. So you're going to want to, in fact, think about not only the technical aspects, but also the reasons why and the how. Because most malicious attackers won't follow a fixed pattern, especially the really experienced ones who really want to get into your environment. As a practice, you're working with no indicators, right? You're just working with logs, events, data that you've gathered, and you're trying to do a deep analysis of anything that's potentially compromised. And you're looking for things that evade automatic detection. So this isn't going to be responding to an alert because you have a tool and an endpoint, or that your firewall has generated a bunch of alerts, or that your next-gen firewall has detected an application compromise. That is typically traditional incident response because you have an alert, you know something's gone wrong, so you investigate it. This is actually looking for that initial alert. But to do that, you really have to understand your environment, and you have to understand what normal is in your environment, right? So it's very hard to detect things that are anomalies out of the events that you're looking at if you don't understand where you are. And this is where threat hunting as a service kind of aspect falls apart, because as a threat hunter, you need to know where you are in your organization, how the business is run, what are the typical business drivers, what are the typical business events that flow through. For example, you can see, I like Paco's talk this morning because he was talking about how some of the detections they do is the rise in CPU usage or the rise in usage, and so they capture that. One interesting thing as an internal, if you're in an organization, you're looking at defining normal, think about finance, right? Finance at the end of the month starts to activate a little bit more than it usually does during the month. A lot of the finance servers will use more CPU, use more cycles, have more activity because there's a lot of activity in finance at the end of the month, typically, or at the beginning of the next month. So when you're building that pattern, what you're going to be looking for is outliers, not in that section of the month, but in previous weeks of the month. Because you have to understand that business flow. You have to understand that if something goes wrong on those instances, it's only going to really go wrong. The majority of the time, what you're going to detect it is when it's not the end of the month where the usage is high, right? So the high usage is going to be an anomaly that you're going to be looking for outside of when they're using it normally. When they're using it. So what? So basically, when you're doing this, you're actually so you're defining your baseline, you're defining your normal, you're defining your understanding of the environment. So you're building an active, a footprint against attackers. So what you're looking for is looking at your critical assets and saying, okay, these critical assets are here. This is my, everybody's talking about GDPR nowadays. This is my personal data store, so I'm going to monitor the events on the personal data store more actively than I am on another store because that's something that's critical for me. You also want to kind of do a system and an application gap analysis, right? So you want to look at what are my applications, what are my systems, where do I have monitoring, where don't I have monitoring, what am I looking for in terms of events? And the cool thing about this is that the security teams actually gain knowledge because you have to do this kind of inventory. You have to do this kind of understanding of your infrastructure. We always complain that, there's shadow IT and all this, and we don't know the infrastructure. Applications are spinning up here, left, right, and center. But by going through this process of just trying to define a normal baseline for you to look at events, you're actually building a key knowledge inside your organization, especially the security teams, where you're identifying the applications, you're identifying the business flows. And that's an important part. Business flows matter a lot, right? Because if you see somebody, for example, emailing financial records to an outside address, that might be bad, it might be good. if you don't understand why they're doing it, or if you don't understand what the flow of what the business is trying to achieve, you could be raising alerts for no reason, right? Because it's a question of understanding why somebody would do this. If they're doing it for a reason, then you're good. If they're not, then you want to trigger some investigations. It's really about understanding contextual knowledge and awareness. And the benefit is you're documenting this and you're growing the organizational knowledge. Organizational knowledge is, it used to be, probably still is, one of the big keywords for, manager, C-level type people. Because by building the organizational knowledge, you're understanding how your business actually works. And you're understanding where the gaps are, where the flaws are, and where the positives are. So, threat hunting, like I said, there's a big mess out there, right? There's lots of definitions for it. There's lots of vendors that call themselves doing threat hunting. They're actually doing incident response. The best kind of resources that you can find around threat hunting are actually being still produced by SANS. There's also some independent researchers that are doing some good work. And you have to wade through the mess, right? And that's the problem, is that even outside of the vendors, when you're looking at yourself, when you're trying to do this yourself, you're going to be wading through a mess of information, a lot of information. And it might feel like the top, but it actually really is, a reality is it's the bottom, right? So you go, oh yeah, we're going to do threat hunting, we're going to do this or that. I actually, it's like, but when you're actually sitting in front of 1 million events a day, trying to figure out which one is bad, you feel like that, right, at the bottom. I've actually talked to some organizations where they're complaining because they're not detecting any events because some people started doing threat hunting because they're not doing it right, or they just forgot to do the actual incident response. Threat hunting does not preclude continuing to have your incident response working properly. So you'll need some tools, essentially, but the underlying thing is you need logs. You need lots and lots of logs. So you've got your traditional things like firewalls, IDS, IPS, network devices, endpoint solutions. You've also got other tools that can help, open source ones, OpenDNS, passive, IDS, OpenDNS, passive DNS, autoruns, and PowerShell WMI type commands that you can launch to gather information. The goal is to extract as much information as you can and bring it back centrally so you can analyze it. Because you don't know where the attacker is. You don't know where he's sitting. You don't know what he's going to do. You also need to have a history of logs, right? If you don't have a history of logs, you can't really detect when the first instance occurred, or where you can't really detect how they got in. That's important because when you're looking for something that's unknown, you actually don't know when the real start of the event is. You might see at one point in time that somebody's adding an admin user to one of your servers. But how did he get to that server? Where did he come from? Why is he adding an admin to that server? To understand that, you need to have that hierarchy and that background of logs. So you need to have that history. War is 99% information. It's a good quote, and it's true. In threat hunting, the more information that you have, the better you're off, right? So you're going to capture things like firewall logs, IP addresses, countries they're coming from, business activities, proxy logs. So, when you see proxy logs, port traffic 22, this is my favorite, bytes in, bytes out. Does anybody know why this is important? When you have an endpoint that's doing the same amount of bytes in and the same amount of bytes out through a proxy? Yeah. So typically, if you put a proxy between an endpoint and the internet, especially in a corporate environment, the endpoint will pull down more information than it sends out. Right? Because it's actually good, it's going to go out to the internet, it's going to query a page, the page is going to come down. There's a lot more information coming from the internet into your organization than going out. If you see the same amount of information going out, that means there's something on your endpoint that's sending a lot of data out and getting the information back, right? So this is typically a tunnel, or, as the gentleman in the front said, a forwarder, right? It's a really good indicator to look for. Look for dynamic DNS, unique user strings, right? So in most corporate environments and in most environments, you're going to see that most computers will use the same version of Chrome, the same version of Firefox, same version of Explorer, same version of what the hell is the new browser name in Windows? I can't remember. Edge, thank you. So you're going to use the same version of most companies will use one or two different versions, but they'll have the same batch of versions. They'll all be showing the same end-user agent string. When you start to see unique user strings in your logs, that's kind of a giveaway. Capturing the Windows logs, that's actually quite hard, but you can focus your attempts on log-on attempts, users value to privileged. Antivirus logs are still useful. Mapping your processes, that's really important. Understanding which processes that you have, or we'll get into that a little bit later. And you have your endpoint solutions. The simplest one being something like Sysmon, all the way up to, Cylance, Carbon Black, and all those ones, right? The complicated ones. That can all bring you all that can bring you information. And then you need an environment to process. So typically you get SIM, or you can use the Elk stack. You might want to add analytics, but essentially you just need somewhere where you can just dump all this log information in, and you can query and search it quite easily. Orientation, does it help? So you have a lot of frameworks out there, right? Kill chain. The latest cool one is the MITRE ATT&CK. Okay? Don't get me wrong. I like MITRE ATT&CK. They're doing a really good job of cataloging all the different attack methods and then building a database of indicators. The problem is that a lot of people take that as word, right? So they kind of look at things like in this path, right? So you recon, the attacker recons, does an escalation, obtains creds, move laterally, persistence, and this MITRE is built kind of that way, right? The problem is, if you actually look at attackers, they don't actually follow a path. The good ones, to confuse you, just go all over the place. They won't do things in a logical step. So all those tools that actually look for things in a logical step, they're failing because how many of you do red team or pen testing? A couple. So do you guys actually follow a step-by-step guide when you pen test? No. But most of these frameworks are A, B, C, D, right? You can argue, we can argue about that later tonight, but the problem is, well, let me rephrase that. A lot of vendors use that as law, and they look for the process, right? Getting in, reconnaissance, escalation. They try to categorize all these things. Problem is, it's very hard to categorize. Plus, some techniques, depending on the context, doesn't mean the same thing. So something that you do, like adding a user, might not be privileged escalation. It might be used in the lateral movement phase. So I don't like these. When I'm doing threat hunting, when I'm looking at events, I try to focus on things that are important to me, which is finding those events, finding those anomalies. There's analytics, which is interesting. And they talk about machine learning and analytics. So that's interesting because it can help you actually find what you're doing, remove the noise. There's end user and endpoint behavior analytics. That's good too because you can start to build baselines automatically, quote unquote. I talked about that a little bit this morning, but earlier on, there's some failures in that. Situational awareness is important. You need to understand where your critical assets are, do a risk assessment, understand what's more at risk in your organization or in your environment. And you can use indicators to drive kind of your intelligence. So adding indicators to your process just allows you to identify things that are known. So typically, malicious, at one point in time or another, a malicious attacker will actually try to use something that is known. With machine learning, there's an interesting paper and presentation by, oh crap, I've forgotten his name. Plus he's a friend of mine. Shit. I'll think about it. I'll think of it. If not, just if you want to know who it is, come back and ask me later. So he's Brazilian. Does a lot of machine learning activities. So he did this thing where basically machine learning threat hunting comes in different batches. Matching IOC signature base, that's what you see the most. That's just lame, right? Because you're just doing what everybody else does. When you start to get to the next phase, we're talking about predictive incident response. You're talking about, hunting analytics, stats, methods, you're starting to look at endpoint behavior. Once you get to proactive, you're actually looking more at supervised machine learning, incorporating previous signals and kind of building this whole detection loop where you're understanding and you're building understanding as you go along. The best, and this is where, because it's magic, is emulating a human. You can't emulate a human machine in a machine, and I'll explain why in a bit. So I is not stalking you, just staring intensively. I told you we look at a lot of logs, so you stare at a lot of logs. The problem is, I talked about the MITRE attack, I talked about instant response. So everybody that does threat hunting has some preconceived notions, right? So I want you to stare at this image for a few seconds. Hopefully it'll move on by itself. Okay, so there's this author called Amy Herman. She wrote this book called Visual Intelligence. She works with, so she's got a doctorate in law and art or something like that. Can't remember. That's not the important part. But she teaches forensics people how to relook at things. Because we have, as humans, an inbred activity of just assuming things and looking at things in the way we've been taught. And you missee things, right? So she boils this down to what can be described as the 4 A's. So you assess, you analyze, you articulate, you adapt, and you repeat, right? So basically, the problem that I found with threat hunting is that it's like, this is a good quote from Henry David Thoreau, where you find only the things that we're looking for. So, we hear in the news, APT 29 group has launched this new attack. So what are you going to do? You're going to go through all your logs and look for indicators of APT 29. Not thinking that it could be something completely different, right? Just because you think that you're a target of APT 29 doesn't mean you're actually a target of APT 29. You could be a target of somebody completely different. And so we inbred into our minds that we're looking for something specific. We're looking for things that people are talking to us. And even if you don't do it consciously, you're doing it unconsciously. Part of this is, part of the assess and analyze is, so this is a quote from actually Leonardo da Vinci, right? It's Latin. It's Latin that means teaching yourself how to read, how to look, how to see, right? Essentially. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what it means. So you need to teach yourself how to relook at things. So like for example, how many of you when you came into the room, here's a question. How many pieces of art are in this room? Without turning around, just think straight away. How many pieces of art? No? So look around. There's only one. Okay? That's the point, is that we walk into something, we don't necessarily look at things, and we're targeted, we're looking for something specific. We don't see what's going on. Same, so you gotta be careful of that. I felt through these walls are a little bit blank, so it was really hard to find a good example. Because the other one I was thinking is how many electrical plugs are on the wall at a high level? There's actually 5, right? 6. See, even I can get it wrong. Because I don't look at, same problem. It's like you do it, right? And that's what we call intentional blindness, because we're looking at something and we're seeing what we want to see, right? Because we're not looking at it correctly. The Matrix, right? The girl in the red, that's intentional blindness. Because he's looking for something specific, he's looking for the bad guy, and he completely misses the girl in the red. Right? Or he's focused on what's his name, and he just misses the girl in the red that walks past. It's intentional blindness. You're focused on one thing, you're not seeing what's going on the sides. So when you're looking for, we'll get into it. So when you're looking for an event, the problem is this, like, if you're looking for something specific, you're probably missing other events that are going on around you. Don't make assumptions. Assumptions are dangerous, right? And that's where you think, this is a picture of a girl, right? But what is she actually doing? Okay, so there's up there, it looks like from here, it looks like a picture of a cat. But it's actually, it looks like a picture of a table and a guitar and some flower pots, right? You kind of can't make assumptions. You need to really analyze what you're looking at. And you've got to get perspective. So put yourself in the mindset. So I want you to count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. Oops, that didn't work. Come on, play. Why isn't it playing? Come on, it play. Sorry, I'm trying to see if I can make this play. It was playing earlier. I checked this earlier. Yeah, now it's playing. So you're counting the white players, right? Okay. So, what's the answer? Correct. But that's not I don't care about that. Who saw the gorilla? That's pretty good, because it's slow. Okay, next one. Who saw one of the black players leave? A lot less. So, probably 4 people in the room, compared to half the room earlier, right? Finally, who saw the change of color in the curtains? About the same for 4 or 5 people. That's intentional blindness. I asked you to focus on one thing, you looked at that one thing, and you could potentially miss out on other things. And this, in threat hunting, for me, that's when you're actually, we're back to the APT story. If you're looking for APT 29 actor in your environment, you're potentially missing out on a lot. So, what is this a picture of? Okay, we've got a couple of people who've seen this before, who have got good eyes. It's a cow. You didn't see it. You don't see it, right? So basically, it's a staring exercise. This is Crenshaw's cow. And if you actually, so if I draw it out now, right? You can see the cow, roughly, the cow's head. If I go back, you still see the cow's head, right? It's optical illusion, yes, but it's also, again, focusing your eyes and learning how to see, right? And that's some of the things that I'm doing in terms of the research that I'm doing right now is try to focus how we can actually look at events better, right? So, we can add some data points. And sometimes something's fishy, but it's not my food, right? So it's not actually fishy, right? You need to understand the logic. Something suspicious is not necessarily malicious. So you've got to be really careful, right? An event that you think is suspicious might not be malicious. For example, a few years ago, when people started installing Chrome, a lot of incident response people were like, hey, somebody's installing executables in app data. That's not allowed in our policy. There's something malicious happening here. But it was just people installing Chrome. It's suspicious, but it's not malicious. Well, I know a few people will argue with me, installing Chrome is malicious, but it's Google. They're going to know everything I do on my computer. Oh, God, grow up. Sorry, I'm granting. I'm a curmudgeon. So, processes. Processes are really important on whatever platform you run. You need to understand them. So, which ones are normal? Which ones don't belong, right? Typically, in an enterprise environment, it's pretty easy. In a non-enterprise environment, it's a little bit harder. But in enterprise environments, you usually have a baseline, so you know which applications should be running. Privileged execution. Which applications should run under privileged execution? Which ones do you want them to actually allow them to have admin access? And this is where it gets really interesting, because a lot of third-party applications, to install, they'll abuse this privilege. They don't follow the guidelines by Windows or Apple, and so they try to abuse you. But if you allow that to happen, then the malicious application can actually get in. Which users are running as local admin? That's important as well. Network activity. Most processes won't connect to the network on a normal workstation. So you need to look at things like, why is this application doing this? Or why is this application connecting? Why is this application listening on a port? The interesting one is, I find always is, and I use as an example, is PowerShell. PowerShell or CMD or WScript normally does not need to connect to the internet. Okay? If you see PowerShell, WScript or some tool like that connecting to the internet, it's probably a good indicator that something suspicious is happening. No, I did not say malicious, I just said something suspicious. Right? So you can look for these types of things. You can get more system information. So understanding your kernel and the kernel drivers that you have, right? Stuxnet was actually a kernel driver, a malicious kernel driver. So if you understand which kernel drivers are supposed to be running in your environment, you can start to look for kernel drivers that are anonymous. Oh, never mind, I'm not going to even try. Too tired. Persistence. Persistence. So how many techniques, here's a question for you guys. How many techniques are there of persistence? Anybody think about how persistence techniques? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's quite a few. And every few months I see a new one. But most people think of persistence when they're looking for events. They think, oh, they changed the run key. But you can create persistence by adding a link inside all users on a Windows box. You can create persistence by adding a cron job. You can create persistence by adding a script that by adding a script that runs in when you do a find or a search, right? So there's plenty of ways to do persistence. Do you know what scheduled tasks are supposed to be running on your systems, especially on servers? How about services? Do you know which services are supposed to be on or off, right? Having that baseline understanding, you can start to look at things that are going different. Then there's the endpoint. I used to work in endpoint protection, and the endpoint is important, right? A lot of people focus on the network and on network devices and on network event logs and things like that because they think, oh, it's network. The problem is today there is no perimeter anymore. There is no fixed network. Too many people use different devices. People work offline. People work online. People work at home. People work on the train. People work on the airports. So we don't really have that containing environment that can stop you. Plus now we have the cloud that's massively being used, right? So we've got events coming from the cloud, we've got events coming from machines that are all over the place, and we've got our own internal events. So the thing is, if you're an attacker, who are you going to compromise, right? Most organizations now have a really good defense on the network perimeter and on network servers. Let's just assume that, okay? We know it's not true, but we'll assume that. The real problem is the endpoint. Why is the real problem the endpoint? Because user, right? Because users do stupid things. There's no hiding from it. They do stupid things. You want to pull as many typical indicators as you want from the endpoints. That's the point I'm getting to. And you can collect a lot of stuff, including configurations and things like that. Unfortunately, that's going to generate a crap load of data. Trust me, I flooded Splunk instances, I flooded other SIM instances. You can generate, with the right agent and the right configuration, and this includes something like Sysmon, you can generate potentially 100 megabytes of data per hour, right? It's immense. So what's available? So this was a study I did in 2016. So basically, all of these different products provide you with different indicators. They've evolved. And you've got other things like you can do file captures, bring up event logs, WMI data, strings. But you can go on the cheap and get Sysmon, which does all that too. Right? So you can use Sysmon, and if you configure it right, it'll bring up everything that you need. There's a couple of people doing really good work. Well, Swift on Security started doing some really good work. There's a bunch of forks. There's I think it's CyberDog, or some, Florian something also is doing some really good stuff on that. I'm sorry, I'm having a loss for names this afternoon. But if you look up threat hunting, Sysmon, you'll find plenty of examples. So then you start to do real-time forensics, right? To look at some of the events. That's how you start. So you're looking for things. So this is interesting. So this is basically an indicator of, this was an Excel that's spawning off an executable, going up to a IP address, picking up. The point that I make is that in this example, the URL is a real URL, so it's photos.3.fr. Something you're probably not going to block on your firewalls or on your proxies because it's a real site, right? It's a real commercial site. And you wouldn't know from just having network events, you wouldn't know that that's coming from an endpoint via Excel. And there's no real reason why Excel would be going to that site. And this is where it gets interesting to actually start to look at the events that are being processed that are happening at a process level rather than a network level. You can remarry everything together, but understanding where that connection is coming from can be really important. So you've got more stuff you can do. So this is same thing. So we're going. This is actually this one is bad. So you see WScript going to the internet. Why? This is persistence. So in this one, they're actually using the persistence key. And then this is a loop that's actually going through all the files, checking all the files. And this is just a bash script. And in most cases, not bash, but Windows command line scripts. In most cases, those command line scripts don't really get picked up by much unless you're actually tracking the command line. So this is all data that you can actually extract from an endpoint, right? If you have the right tool set. But it's a lot of data. So, how do you get your hands dirty? Well, you start to look for things. You bring in all your logs, start to look for things, look for very long URIs, look for agent strings, look for DGA, domain aging, you do file executions, things running from %app, %temp, bin, use a local bin, network ports, who's listening on what, which command lines are being run. Then you start to generate a lot of data, so you have to go through it. Command lines are really good, always really good. I love command lines. Things that execute in the wrong place, so CRSS not executing from system 32, it's supposed to be, but executing from temp. You can focus on less frequent things, so an application that only runs once in an environment is usually suspicious, especially in a big environment. So these are all little things that you're looking for, but then you have to pull the thread, right? So you're going to add filtering to remove some noise. You're going to still be looking for something like a 2-character executable name. And you can look for where, and then you can go back up and see where did it come from. So you look at the links or the URLs that were clicked on, right? So all this is data you can gather from the endpoint. Then you can find things like an interactive session trying to add a net user. You can find psexec being run. You can find copy commands, right? Then you can find so you get to this, and you just realize it's a sticky vulnerability, right? So that's RDP when you hit when you go and shift 5 times or something like that, and it runs a CMD. Suspicious PowerShell, right? So this command line, is actually this, right? This is PowerShell that normally shouldn't run on a machine. So you're looking for things like that. You've got to find a starting point. That's the important part. Usually, typically, what I do with starting points is I'm looking for certain applications that are running, right? So these are really simple ones. You're looking for Mimikatz, dump, looking for reg server lines, looking for access to certain command lines, certain Windows shares, PowerShell executables. Does anybody know what this one is? Regex for what? DGAs. So domains. Adding administrators to the local group. So here's some more regexes. You got to learn to love regexes when you're doing threat hunting because you're going to be looking for things and you have no idea what you're looking for, so you build regexes. So I'm looking for anything Explorer that's not executed in one of those directories. I'm looking for any username that's not system administrator running CSRS, right? So these types of things are things you're going to look for. Then you have other things like netlogon, changing the stable password change, so that stop you from changing a password. This is for persistence type techniques. You got current process image, event viewer for MSC files. All of these things are basically indicators that you can start to look for. This is somebody trying to subvert a Windows. Sorry, I'm having trouble this afternoon. HTTP server, right? Does anybody want what this does? No? So this creates a shadow copy, right? Then from the shadow copy, he copies ntds.dit. So that's the local copy of the account database. Copies the SAM database as well. Deletes the shadow copy. And then saves the system key. He then exfiltrates this. Why? Anybody? Up the top. He's got it's AD data. Now he's captured the AD database. He's captured user accounts, probably passwords in it as well. So he's going to go past that thing and find and run Mimikatz on it, or any other tool to parse out AD accounts. This is seen quite frequently, right? This is a obfuscation technique to capture accounts. It works quite well. I've seen it a few times. PowerShell is the new cool, right? Everybody does PowerShell nowadays. But you have to detect PowerShell. Daniel Bohannon does some really cool stuff with PowerShell. Read his blogs. He really thought this through. And this is all documented by Microsoft too. But these are PowerShell commands. Most of them are executing something in the background, or most of them are going out to the internet, right? You got to be kind of crazy to kind of do something like this, right? Because it's basically a bunch of variables that you create and then patch back together to run a PowerShell command. You've also got base 64-bit encoded PowerShell commands. I mean, this is all stuff that you can look for, right? And in most cases, traditional things don't pick this up. A lot of SIMs now are looking for this, and a lot of endpoints have started actually capturing command lines that look a bit weird. But at the beginning, you didn't really have that capability, so you'd have to kind of capture the command line and look for this stuff. And it's really hard. There's some. I was actually talking about Daniel a few years ago, and we came up. He was telling me that because you can escape everything with a single tick, you can create these really long tick escape things. So you can escape, something like the top there, right? So if you look at the detect them, right? I mean, that's just escaped all over the place. And you can put escape characters in everything. Do some of them as ASCII characters. You can do some of them as binary characters. And PowerShell will just parse it. Build a regex for that. It's really, really hard. I still haven't gotten a successful one, to be honest. To actually go look for it. So I scroll through the logs and look for something that's weird. You can link to threat feeds. So if you have access to threat feeds, it's always useful. You can link to VirusTotal, for example. If you have VirusTotal, the idea there is that to minimize your workload, you're going to automatically try and have your SIM match MD5s or SHA-256s to existing known bads. Because if you have an existing known bad, you can basically take that away and just say, okay, that's a known bad. I'm going to send that to incident response, normal incident response, and they can take care of it while I go and find other stuff. So, how do you do this in practice? Well, I already said we need a SIM, we need things, right? So if you want to do it yourself, you can, especially if you don't have any money, you just want to do it, try it out. You got 3 really cool options that are inexpensive, or 3. They're limited in size. Splunk, you can get, I think it's 100 megabytes a day or something like that. License, developer license, they're 3. Humio has a cloud service. I think it's about 100 megabytes of data a day. Right? So it's just an analytics platform, simple SIM, where you can dump your data. Of course, you can always build an elastic stack. That you can do by yourself. It's open source mostly, so you can do that. So then you're going to start bringing in your data. So bring in your network data, bro IDS, syslog. That will just feed into these things. So anybody use bro IDS? I think they use Elasticsearch now, don't they? Yeah. So you can. Network data is always good. I don't use network data because I'm more interested in what's happening on the endpoint than the network. So on the endpoint, you can do a bunch of stuff. You can do sysmon, just pull out the event logs. For Windows, it's pretty hard because actually sending the event logs to a central server is really difficult. You can use GRUR, right? Everybody knows what GRUR is, right? It's a Google toolkit to do rapid response. It's useful, it's powerful, but it's more forensic focused. So you're going to use it once you think there's a compromised host to get more data. And there are other tool sets as well. In most cases, when you're going through the endpoint, you have to have some kind of tool to be able to throw that stuff into your back-end analytics stack. So you're going to have, either a homegrown tool. Elastic has beats, which allows you to forward anything into Elastic, and you've got Splunk has a universal forwarder, which allows you to send events and event logs into Splunk. So once you have all that inside, you can basically start your threat hunting. And it's literally just going through the logs and looking for some anonymous data, looking for weird PowerShell. So if you're pen tester, or if you're playing around with, trying to hack a box, set this up, hack that box, and see what comes out. Right? Look for those events. You can start to build your experience. But traditionally, it's much better if you already have incident response experience in the background. Mostly because you understand the methodologies of identifying an event and classifying it as an incident. In the enterprise, it's a little bit more complicated because you usually have existing resources, you usually have a SOC, you usually have an incident response team. So I found it practical to kind of identify those people that are interesting, but would be different thinkers. Because you need to have thinkers, you need to have creative people, so you need to have people that understand, that are able to think outside the box. Give them a bit of time, and have them build a plan and documentation. Start small, and then you can refine the process. And then you can start to incorporate it into incident handling. The idea is not to go from incident handling to threat hunting. That doesn't work. You need to add threat hunting to your incident handling. I've seen motivational things too, an Amazon gift card to the first person who finds something that we've never seen before. That helps as well because people will get into it, because it's a tedious job. It's not easy. That's it. Got a few minutes to spare. Questions? I know I went through this fast and my brain's a little bit miswired this afternoon. Sorry about that. But I'll be around until tomorrow, so if you have any questions. Questions? Did I blow your minds? Is that it? It's weird because, I see a lot of people, the incident response community is all hyped on this threat hunting, but in fact, they're just relabeling a lot of what they're doing now into threat hunting because it's just good keyword. But if you're actually looking for things that are unknown, it's a completely different process. It's a completely different mindset. Oh, cool. A question? What? One question.
Suspicious way of thinking and looking at things differently. How long does it usually take you to do some threat hunting and finding stuff? Is it going to take a long time?
Yeah. So the question is, with all this suspicious thinking and malicious type of activities, how long does it take you to actually do threat hunting to find something? It really depends. I could spend, so the fastest I found something is probably within 2-3 hours. And I was going through 5 times 50 megabytes of logs. Just endpoint logs. Because I just had the endpoint logs and I was looking, I found, I found a piece of ransomware that had never been detected before. And it had gone right through the normal controls because, I think you were at my ransomware talk this morning, right? Because it was an executable that was known as a normal executable and a good executable for most antivireware. So it just went right past.
And how about the overall knowledge? Do you find it easily transferable to some other person that might not repeat what you do?
The aspect of teaching and understanding things like what a command line should look like, what a bad command line looks like is okay. The actual creative thinking part of it, no, it's very hard. It is about the person, right? It's a lot about the person's ability to think outside the box. You can't really teach people to think outside the box. You can try and, help them build a new knowledge set and hope they'll pick up that knowledge set and go one step further. But a lot of times, what I found is that people are so busy doing their day job but they don't have time to like step back and say, oh, wait, I got to rethink this, right? So it's, you know, the when I was talking about the art of perception, it's exactly that. It's like you look at something, step away, think about it, do something else, go back, look at it again. Do you still have the same response? Do you still have the same, you know, gut feeling? Do you still think it's still this? Do you still seeing the same thing? And that's something that's very hard to teach. You just, and you just have to get people to do it and just repeat and rinse. I mean, a lot of times I miss things, right? I mean, I passed, just trying to see if I can, yeah, I passed like 150 megs of logs one time, and I completely missed something. And when I went back a few days later, because the guy was complaining that there was definitely something there, I actually found I found something. It was just really obscure, and it was one event. The problem is there was one event. That event had crashed the machine, and the event logging and it completely changed. And so, and I hadn't thought, when I originally did that analysis, I hadn't thought about that. I just thought that the machine was just working normally, right? It's when I took a deeper dive and I saw that after the event that created the incident, I actually saw that there was a log-on event that I hadn't noticed before because I wasn't looking for it, right? I was looking, there was a process that got launched. I knew that much, and something should have happened afterwards. I just didn't realize that the machine had completely blue screen, rebooted, and the guy had logged back in, right? And if you don't kind of take that mindset and that step back, you don't see it, right? And teaching that is hard. I mean, it's a way of thinking, right? It's like, it's getting people to do it, practice. Mentoring helps a lot, right? So you're working side by side, you know, having two people look at the same thing, one more experienced, one less experienced. If the more experienced sees something that the other guy doesn't see, you can drive that person to see it. I do that a lot of times when I'm mentoring people, I'll see something and the guy will go, no, I don't see anything, or no, I don't, you know, this is the way. I'm like, you know, there's a better way to do this kind of thing, right? Look at it again, right? Think about your code, right? The joke I always say, because I used to help these guys do some scripts, and so the script was like an XML based, and essentially you have an AND that manages everything. So your AND your block to actually do the logic. So they would put an AND inside an AND inside an AND. So what's an AND inside an AND inside an AND? It's an AND. You don't need all that recursion, right? Because whatever happens, it's always, if you flatten it out, it's the same thing. You don't need to put all those steps inside a step, right? And that's something that you can teach the sensor, explain the logic, but it's something that it's preconceived ideas and preconceived notions that the person has to get rid of, and you kind of have to do that by yourself. It's about preconception and pre-knowledge, right? If you're used to doing things in one way, you're going to keep doing it in that one way. I mean, I've been around for a long time. I used to hire people to do network security and network deployments, and I used to love it. And no offense to all the students, but I used to love it when students we'd come to the interviews. We were hiring fresh outs. It's like, oh yeah, no, network works like this, this, and this, and I'm like, The reality of the thing is that it doesn't really work that way. In books, it works that way. But I can demonstrate ways where you can bypass all that stuff, where you can change things and you can do things in a different way. And it doesn't work the way that you've learned it in the books, right? And that's experience, and it's also breaking down your preconceived notions. It's hard. Any other questions?
Why would people ask you to do threat hunting?
So the question is, why would people ask you to do threat hunting? So that's the main reason is because their instant response isn't working, or they've hit the maximum capabilities of their instant response. Right. So typically, you've got your SOC. They're looking at the SIMs. They've built their dashboards. They've built their event detections, but the company's still being compromised. Typically, that means that the well, the current process is working to a certain extent, but they're missing out on things. So one of the things I mean, I have to try and get this into a time. I can do this for like 3 hours, okay? The thing is like, is there a marker somewhere? Because there's a whiteboard. I can use a whiteboard in this one. We've got a bit of time. You don't have to record me for this one. Oh, there's a marker. So remember the Aoda loop, right? So you got the orient and decide, act, right? So you got this loop. Typically, your current SOC, they're working in this environment, right? They're working at that level and into that level when they do the actual containment. The problem is that to get to this level, you have to already have mapped out all of your indicators, all of the things that you're looking for. When an attacker introduces something new into your environment, you don't necessarily know about it, so you're missing it. So the idea of threat hunting is to actually come into here, say, okay, I'm looking for something new. I've identified something new, some new method, right? Or I've seen that this APT29 group is in my environment, so now I've got the indicators, and you actually feed them into here. Okay. So it's essentially about preparing your environment and understanding and gaining new knowledge to then feed it into your typical SOC and incident response team process. This isn't a standalone type thing. It's really upstream, understand what you're doing, or understand what's going on, understand new things that are going on, and add them into your normal thing. I mean, when I detect stuff, I don't do anything about it. I just tell the people, it's like, okay, I've passed your logs, I found this. These are the hosts that are compromised. Now go back into your SIM and look for every host that's showing the same indicators. And we're back to here. We're back to the traditional incident response. So it's really about finding something that you haven't seen before. And so Mandiant, right? That's what they're calling now their incident when they come in and do incident response in your environment when you've been compromised. Hold on.
If you don't have all of your logs up front and you've been compromised.
That's when you fall back on forensics. Typically, you can get the forensics out. But yeah, I mean, if we used to talk about, I think Verizon still says it's the mean time to detection is like 3-4 months or something like that, or years. So how do you store years worth of logs? You don't really. There's flaws in the threat hunting idea. There's certain flaws, like the ability to store all these logs. But that's where we're starting to see analytics platforms come in. So they'll start to do analysis, they'll start to baseline things, and they'll start to kind of capture the things that are on the fly and try to highlight certain things. My personal gut feeling is that as we go, we'll just find the malicious people just find more ways to bypass all this stuff, right? I mean, it's quite easy to jump around from different techniques and hide yourself, obfuscate yourself, using PowerShell, for example. I mean, I know a lot of organizations, because they follow things like Microsoft's recommendations, so they have GPOs, the GPOs are on PowerShell, and you see a lot of PowerShell in an organization, right? I've seen like organizations, they have all these Windows command line scripts in their GPOs, so when your guy boots on, it does everything like it says to desktop, does this, does that. And like the first time you look at it, you're like, ooh, that looks suspicious. Then you actually extract the whole script, because if you have all the command lines, you have the whole script, you're like, okay, he's doing this, this, and that. And then you look at where you're coming from, and you're like, oh, okay, it's a GPO script. These guys are morons. Because I've seen some nasty things that I cannot say on camera or recording. Well, it was a break, right? So.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.